Elliot Granger had always sat quietly in the same booth at Miller's tap room, sipping bourbon and honoring fallen teammates. But when a new owner, blind to his story, coldly asked him to leave, Elliot said nothing. He simply folded a list of names and walked out. The town didn't react at first, but the next morning, 6 silent men arrived with a photo and a folded flag revealing the truth. Elliot had carried half of SEAL Team 3 through hell. That day, the silence spoke louder than words, and the town of Port Wells would never see that bar, or each other, the same way again. If this story moved you, support our mission by liking, subscribing, and hitting the bell on my channel. We share powerful true stories that often go unheard. Help us honor those who serve quietly, live with dignity, and teach us that sometimes the strongest voices are the ones that never shout. Hey, old man, you're making the place look bad. The words cut through the air, sharp, deliberate, and loud enough to sting. They weren't whispered. They weren't meant to be. Everyone in the bar heard it. The man they were aimed at sat alone in the corner. He didn't shift, didn't flinch. He simply looked up. Dusty boots planted firm, a worn jacket draped across his frame like an old story no one had the patience to hear. His eyes, steady and unreadable, met no one's in particular. He didn't defend himself, didn't rise to the insult, just reached calmly for his old cap, laid a crumpled $10 bill on the counter with quiet dignity, and left. No words, no scene. He stepped out into the night as unnoticed as he had come in. No one called after him. No one stood up. But the next morning something shifted. The front door creaked open just past 8. The regulars had already taken their spots, coffee steaming beside yesterday's regrets. 6 men walked in, silent and deliberate. They wore no uniforms, offered no greetings. Oh, they carried presents, not introductions. One of them laid a folded American flag on the counter like a quiet indictment. Another placed a faded photograph beside it. 7 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder under harsh sun, grime and resolve etched across their faces. Then a voice, low and cool, pierced the stillness. You threw out the man who carried half this team through hell. No shouting followed. No arguments broke out. But the weight of silence that followed spoke louder than any fist ever could. At the edge of Port Wells, Maine, there's a small house weathered by salt air and time. 2 rooms, a leaning fence, a chimney whose rust is more memory than metal. Wind from the Atlantic chews at the paint like an old grudge. But if you happen by just before sunrise, you might catch the scent of fresh cedar or hear the steady hum of an aging table saw, still stubbornly working. That's where Elliot Granger lives. 72, give or take, depending on the tide and his mood. Most in town don't know the full story, just that he showed up 15 winters ago, bought the old Harrington place, and turned it into a one-man repair shop with nothing but a toolbox and a truck that sounds like it wheezes between breaths. He's not a big man, but he looks built by time, lean, tough, like someone who's held his ground in more than just snowstorms. His hands are thick with calluses and stories he doesn't tell. His jaw's set like conversation's always been optional. Hair's mostly gone, beard kept neat out of habit more than vanity. But it's his eyes that people remember. They don't dart. They don't plead. They simply stay, fixed and steady, like a compass that once pointed through war and fire and never stopped spinning. To the newcomers, he's just Mr. Granger, or that old guy with the oil can. But the town's lifers, the ones who still remember the cannery and the whistle at noon, no more. Bits and scraps. They say he was with SEAL Team 3, that he ran recon in the Gulf, that sometime between 81 and 92, he crawled through a burning tunnel under a Beirut hotel to pull 6 civilians to safety. No backup, just hand signals and grit. But Granger doesn't talk about that. He fixes things. Fence posts shattered by storms. Broken heaters in February's cruelest cold. Electrical wiring with the mind of its own. He never charges much. And if you're a widow, a single mother, or just having a stretch of bad luck, he'll waive off payment like sandwich, and coffee were all he came for anyway. Every Monday and Wednesday, he shows up at the Port Wells Youth Center, not on payroll, never announced, to teach auto shop. He teaches the kids how to change brake lines, test circuits, keep calm when sparks fly. The boys listen because he doesn't yell. He simply knows. And the girls show up because he never talks down to them the way others do. But it's what he does on Fridays that no one questions. At exactly 4:45 p.m., Elliot Granger walks the same 3 blocks to Miller's tap room. The bar's nothing fancy, wooden floors that creak, a chalkboard menu that never changes, and whiskey-soaked walls that remember more than most. He always sits in the same booth, by the window, far from the jukebox. Orders one drink, bourbon, neat. Never asks for the volume on the TV to drop, even when the football game roars or the news flashes some forgotten tragedy. He just sits, sips slowly, and pulls a folded piece of paper from his inside coat pocket. No one's ever dared ask what's written on it. But Josie, a new waitress once, caught a glance, said it was a list. 7 names, handwritten. No ranks, no dates, just names. He reads them silently, then folds the paper back with careful hands, like returning something holy to its altar. For that 1 hour, Elliot Granger is somewhere else. Maybe in a jungle again, radio static buzzing beside sweat-soaked silence. Maybe flat on a rooftop, rifle steady, breath shallow beneath a foreign moon. Maybe dragging someone heavier than himself through smoke and sand while the sky cracked open behind them. Or maybe he's just sitting with ghosts no one else remembers but him. The bar regulars don't interrupt. No cheers, no stories, no curious jabs about the past. They don't know his full story, but they know enough to leave that booth untouched. Even on the busiest nights, when seats are scarce and tempers short, that corner remains empty. His drink, untouched. His space, sacred. Because respect doesn't always need a speech. Sometimes it's just the silence we offer a man who never asked for thanks. Only a place to remember. And maybe all along, that's what Elliot Granger has been doing. Not trying to forget, not trying to move on, just showing up. 2 weeks had passed since the bar had changed ownership, but for the regular at Miller's tap room, the shift wasn't immediately noticeable. The stools were still in their usual spots, the dartboard still dusty and crooked, and the same clatter of pint glasses echoed behind the bar. Yet gradually something intangible began to change. One morning, the old jukebox that used to hum out Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash sat dark and silent. In its place, a sleek Bluetooth speaker began murmuring unfamiliar synth beats that felt cold and distant to the locals. The chalkboard menu was replaced with laminated cards featuring glossy cocktail names, spiced maple old-fashions, coastal basil mules, and a concoction served in a mason jar with a rosemary sprig that looked more decorative than drinkable. Then came the uniforms. Polished, matching polo shirts branded with Miller's Tap Room. The bartenders were young, all new, trained to pour only when a card was already on the counter. They didn't know who Elliot Granger was. They didn't know the town, but Colin Miller did. He was a local, Port Wells born and raised, the son of Frank Miller, who had run the tap room for 34 years until a stroke forced him into early retirement. Frank had built Miller's on tradition. Sawdust on the floor during fishing season, free drinks on Veterans Day, and a kind of loyalty you couldn't fake. But Colin hadn't inherited that. Not the patience, not the grit, just the deed and the hunger. At 28, Colin had returned from Portland, fresh from 8 years of grinding through the startup circuit. He came back not to preserve the bar, but to rebrand it. He envisioned something modern, Insta-worthy, worthy of glossy travel blogs, while keeping just enough of its name to look local. In that vision, there was no room for weather jackets, old war stories, or men like Elliot Granger. So when Elliot strolled in on Friday at 5, same as he had for years, and quietly took his usual place in the corner booth, Colin noticed. And he didn't like it. Elliot hadn't changed. He wore his worn field jacket, his scuffed leather boots, and that same cap that looked like it had seen more of the world than Colin's entire camera roll. From behind the bar, arms crossed, Colin watched him silently, watched him unfold that same piece of paper, watched him sip from his glass without a word, showing no reaction to the new music or trendy crowd. To Colin, it wasn't nostalgia. It was defiance. He walked down the bar, slapping a bar towel in his hand, and stopped at the booth. Conversations didn't stop, but they softened. People glanced over. Colin leaned in, voice just loud enough to carry. "This isn't a shelter, old man. Take your cheap whiskey and key." Elliot didn't flinch. His eyes held no anger, no defense. Just a slow fold of the paper, more careful this time, as if it meant something to him. He reached inside his jacket, took out a $10 bill, creased and clean, and laid it beside his half-finished drink. He picked up his cap, stood, and walked out. No reply, no protest, just the thump of boots against hardwood and the sigh of the door swinging closed behind him. Colin stood there for a moment, as if expecting someone, anyone, to applaud. No one did. A couple near the dartboard shifted in their seats. Reggie, the old bartender, paused mid-wipe, jaw clenched. A young waitress, new that week, stared at the floor, unsure of what she'd just witnessed but certain it felt wrong. Still no one spoke. Colin shrugged, muttered to himself, "Guy thinks this place is still a damn VFW hall," and walked back behind the bar. And that was it. Elliot was gone. Gone from the bar he'd entered every week for years. Gone from the booth that had quietly become his. Gone from the shared conversations that, from that night on, would carry his absence more heavily than they'd ever carried his presence. Outside, the coastal wind pushed salt and sea air through the streets. Elliot didn't look back. He didn't have to. Inside, something shifted, not loudly, not violently, but deeply. The kind of shift that leaves a bruise, not a wound. Reggie set the same glass down he'd been holding. Walked over to the counter, wiped the ring where Elliot's drink had rested. Then, without a word, he picked up the $10 bill and gently slipped it into the tip jar. "He always paid first," he said quietly. "Not to anyone in particular. Never asked for more than he used." No one responded. The bar didn't erupt in chatter. It didn't rage or rally. It simply hushed. And in the corner, Elliot's booth, half shadowed by the fading sun, seemed louder than anything else in the room. The next morning, the air was damp and sharp with sea salt. Gulls circled the docks in a slow, constant rhythm. Most of Port Wells was still nestled indoors, coffee in hand, eyes scanning the paper, kettles slowly hissing on stoves. But inside Miller's tap room, the crew was already moving, sweeping floors, setting tables for the brunch crowd. Behind the bar stood Colin, sleeves rolled, face pale and tired, but with a look of cold satisfaction. He hadn't slept much, but that didn't matter to him. In his mind, the step he'd taken the night before had been necessary. Colin had always known the bar needed a new beginning. His father's place, once sacred ground for war stories and weathered souls, now needed a fresh coat of relevance. The old regulars, with their rituals and ghosts, had to step aside for younger crowds with louder playlists and cleaner shoes. Colin wasn't cruel about it. It was just business. Progress meant not clinging to the past. But all of that conviction lasted exactly until 9:02 a.m. The front door didn't swing open or slam. It creaked, slow and intentional, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The hum of conversation fell silent. 6 men entered in single file. No uniforms, no badges. Just dark jackets, faded jeans, and a gravity that didn't need explanation. They didn't speak, didn't grin. Yet somehow they said everything with the way they walked, the way their presence rearranged the room's air. Discipline, loyalty, a quiet kind of power clung to them like smoke. Colin blinked, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks. He glanced at Reggie, the old bartender, hoping for some sign of recognition or guidance. But Reggie stood still behind the counter, glass in hand, face unreadable. The man in front, tall and solid with salt and pepper hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen through fire, stepped forward and placed something on the bar. An old wooden picture frame, gently and with care. 7 men were frozen inside the photo, arms linked, desert dust on their faces. In the center, Elliot Granger. Younger, yes, but unmistakable. Those same eyes, that same jawline set like granite. A half smile barely emerged under the fatigue. The others looked sunburned, exhausted, alive with brotherhood. Another man moved forward and laid something beside it. A folded American flag, the kind shaped by ceremony. Its corners were perfectly tight, but the fabric showed signs of age. Reverent, as though the flag itself remembered everything it had seen. It landed on the counter like it belonged there. Still, no one in the bar moved, not even the air. Colin cleared his throat and stepped forward, forcing out the words. I'm sorry. Can I help you fellas with something? The first man met his eyes. His voice was soft but absolute. You threw out the man who carried half this team through hell. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The truth made enough noise on its own. Colin's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. I didn't know who he was. A third man stepped forward, face calm but stern. His knuckles were scarred, hands weathered. Exactly. You never asked. The room thickened with silence. The neon sign above the bar hummed faintly. Even the wind outside seemed to pause and listen. At the back of the bar, an older man slowly stood and removed his cap. Near the jukebox, a teenage worker named Theo Martinez stepped forward, phone in hand. Its screen had gone dark, but he held it like it mattered. Nervous energy pulsed from him, but his voice didn't shake. I recorded it, he said, eyes never leaving Colin. Didn't know why at first, but I showed it to my dad when I got home. The seals turned, Theo's hands tightened around the phone. My dad served with Elliot, said that man saved his life. One of the older seals, hair gone gray, a limp trailing behind him like memory, gave a slow nod. We all owe him. Then came the sound from the back entrance, slow, uneven footsteps, followed by the firm tap of a cane. Frank Miller stepped inside. His face had thinned, his shoulders bent lower than before his stroke, but his eyes still knew exactly what they were looking at. He saw the flag, the photo, then his son. His voice was hoarse but steady. You embarrassed this place, he said. Now fix it. Colin's shoulders sank. The weight of 100 moments pressed down on his chest. A seal stepped closer, not threatening, but resolute. We didn't come here to humiliate you, he said. We came to honor the man you chose not to see. Stillness followed, then motion. Slow, purposeful. One of the men approached the far wall, tapping a blank spot between two sports posters. Another followed, pulling a small shadow box from his coat. Inside was the folded flag, now placed in a wooden frame. The photo joined it. They moved with quiet rhythm, practiced precision. No one needed instructions. They had done this before, in harder places, under darker skies. Above it all, a plaque was drilled into the wall. Elliot Granger, SEAL Team 3, Quiet Valor. Theo stood nearby, his voice cracking under the weight of everything. Last night, you treated him like he was nobody, but that man saved my dad in Kandahar, and that deserves more than silence. One of the SEALs, with a scar arcing over his eye, turned to Colin one last time. He may never walk through that door again, but the real question is, will this ever be the kind of place he'd want to? They didn't linger. No drinks, no nods. They turned and left, as silent as they came, their unity louder than any speech. But they didn't leave the bar the same. They left behind something stronger than presence. A challenge, a reckoning, and a change. A bar transformed, a town awakened, and a question that wouldn't stop echoing. By noon, the video had already taken flight. Theo posted the 32-second clip to a private Facebook group for veterans, his dad's old unit. No background music, no dramatic text, just a clip. 6 men walking into a bar, placing a flag and a photo on the counter, and one sentence that silenced every viewer. You threw out the man who carried half this team through hell. No shouting, no spectacle, just presence, just truth. Within 2 hours, the video had been shared 12,000 times. By dinner, it was on Reddit, captioned only, "When silence speaks louder than anything." That saying, "the quiet ones are the legends," wasn't just a passing phrase. It resonated through the heart of Port Wells that night. A small-town news station picked up the story, giving it the headline, "Veterans stand up for one of their own in the most dignified way possible." But back in Port Wells, the change wasn't something virtual, something trending online. It was tangible. It was in the air, in the eyes of those who'd known Elliot Granger without ever truly seeing him. Helen Drake, who'd worked the front counter at the post office for 22 years, quietly placed a modest bouquet at the base of Miller's bar door. "He rewired my porch light after my husband died," she told the mail carrier. Didn't charge me. Didn't even take a cookie. No fanfare, just memory, gratitude, and the kind of respect that grows in silence. At Lincoln Middle School, Mr. Halverson, the civics teacher, who also served in the Army Reserves, brought Elliot's story into his ethics class. He printed out the transcript and asked his students to read it closely. On the blackboard, he wrote in capital letters, "Dignity isn't always loud." One student wrote, "Respect doesn't come from a uniform. It comes from how someone shows up when no one's watching." Another said, "I want to be the kind of person who notices people even when no one else does." The message wasn't broadcast or forced. It spread naturally, as if whispered from one soul to another. And the following Friday, something subtle but deeply moving happened. Elliot didn't show up at his usual time, but his seat wasn't left unmarked. Someone had placed a note card in tidy handwriting that simply read, "Reserved for Mr. Granger." Beside him sat a full glass of water, untouched, still, waiting. By 6 p.m., people began arriving, not for drinks, but to witness. A young mom with a toddler on her hip, a Coast Guard veteran limping with age. Teenagers who usually loitered behind the gas station came too, hoods down, voices low. They weren't there to party. They were there in case he came. And at 6:12, the door opened. Elliot stepped in wearing the same field jacket, cap in hand. He didn't appear angry. He wasn't surprised, just steady. The room didn't erupt. No applause, no rising. But every head turned, every conversation paused. Only the hum of the neon light and the soft creak of floorboards filled the quiet. He saw the note, the water, paused, then sat down. Behind the bar, Reggie poured a bourbon, unasked, walked it over himself and placed it gently beside the water. "This one's on the house," he said. Elliot gave a single nod, calm and quiet, then set down a folded paper tent on the napkin beside the drink. The silence that followed didn't feel hollow, it felt full. It carried meaning. Then slowly it gave way to quiet conversation, a bit of soft music, an atmosphere of mutual regard that wasn't orchestrated. It just was. From the corner, Theo approached, hands deep in his hoodie pocket, voice low with hesitation. "Sir, but I didn't mean to put you on display. I thought people should know." Elliot looked at him. No resentment in his eyes, no trace of irritation, just a small, tired smile. "Sometimes they need reminding," he said. That weekend, something shifted beyond reverence. The people of Port Wells began to act. Colin Miller, still shaken by the storm he'd unintentionally set off, called for a community meeting at the VFW hall. Dozens attended, not to debate, but to build. A retired carpenter volunteered to construct a display case. The mayor offered a commemorative plaque. A high school art teacher designed a mural for the west wall of Miller's. A desert sun, 7 silhouettes, no names. They called it One Flag, One Table. Every last Friday of the month, Elliot's table would remain empty. A folded flag would rest there, and anyone, veteran or civilian, could sit quietly beside it in remembrance, in gratitude. No microphones, no speeches, just presence. Soon, other towns caught on. The video made its way to national media. Elliot's name and face appeared on screens across the country, though he never knew. He didn't check. He didn't own a television. He didn't use social media. And when someone tried to thank him too publicly, he'd nod with courtesy, then gently change the subject. But Port Wells wasn't the same. Boys at the grocery store began saluting him. A church gave him the key to the old community workshop. High schoolers wrote about him in their essays, even though they didn't know the full story. And still, every Friday, Elliot returned to Miller's. Same seat, same drink, same folded paper tucked into his coat pocket. He never read it aloud. He didn't have to. By now, everyone understood. It wasn't just a list. It was his reason. Change came not with thunder, but like a steady tide. Quiet and sure. Miller's tap room transformed, not just in atmosphere, but in soul. First, the cocktail menu came down. Colin Miller took it off the wall himself. He didn't throw it away. He folded it carefully and stored it. It wasn't erasure, it was understanding. He was learning what had always been there long before he showed up. Then came the tribute wall. Reggie, who'd spent more years pouring drinks than most patrons had spent alive, cleared out the wood-paneled space by the windows. He cleaned the wall, hung new lighting, and mounted a glass case at the center. Inside it sat the folded flag, the very one that had first been placed. That morning it sat quietly on the counter, a photograph of SEAL Team 3 placed beside the case. 7 men, shoulder to shoulder under a blistering desert sun, grit and laughter blending across sunburned faces. Sand stuck to their teeth, but their smiles were bright, their bond unmistakable. In front of the case, an oak plaque stood out, carved with care. It caught the light in that soft, reverent way wood does when it seems to hold something sacred. It read, Elliot Granger, SEAL Team 3, Quiet Valor. But Colin didn't stop with just honoring Elliot. He worked hand in hand with local veterans to build something bigger. Not a tribute of medals or ranks, no gleam or glory, but a wall filled with names and faces, portraits in black and white, notes handwritten by grieving families, snapshots of young soldiers, women and men in uniform, framed in simplicity. No show, no spotlight. At the center of the wall sat a single empty chair beneath a sign that read, plainly but powerfully, seat for the silent ones. It wasn't long before others joined the quiet momentum. A high school boy from the local art class, moved by a video clip that had gone viral, brought in a painting. It showed a man seated alone at a bar table. But behind him, instead of darkness, loomed faint silhouettes, 6 other figures, tall and strong, visible only in spirit, yet fully present. Colin mounted the painting on the wall facing the booth where Elliot always sat. In that booth, it became sacred too. Every Friday night, no exceptions, that table was the first one clean. At exactly 4:45 p.m., a glass of bourbon was set in place. Even if Elliot hadn't yet arrived, a napkin would be folded twice with a $10 bill tucked underneath. Elliot never asked for this ritual, but no one in Port Wells did it for thanks. They did it because they had witnessed something rare. When Elliot finally did speak, if you could call it speaking, it wasn't from a podium. There was no microphone. It happened during the very first one-table event. The place was full, standing room only, but there was no loud chatter, no raucous laughter, just a hush, a kind of quiet that felt like reverence, like everyone had come not to be entertained but to remember. Colin offered Elliot the mic. He declined. Instead, Elliot stood next to the table. He looked around, cap in hand, his gaze sweeping over the faces of strangers and neighbors alike. Then he said in a steady voice, only this, I'm not here to be praised. I'm just here so no other vet has to sit in silence again. That was all, no dramatic ending, no applause, just a long, heavy stillness. And then, without prompting, one by one, people began to stand. Not for noise, for respect. Word spread in whispers the way meaningful things do. Bars across other towns adopted the one-flag tradition. Some sent folded flags to Miller's as tribute. A handful of Vietnam veterans even crossed state lines just to sit at Elliot's table. They didn't come to talk. They just needed to be near someone who bore the same quiet weight. One night, a young Marine came in, still in civilian clothes, still carrying something heavy across his shoulders. He didn't say much, just nodded toward Elliot and asked if he could sit with him. Elliot didn't hesitate. He slid the second glass of bourbon across the table without a word. They didn't speak, not for a good 30 minutes, but by the time the Marine stood, his eyes looked different, softer. He left behind his unit patch, folded with care, and placed it beside the glass. That patch remains on the wall to this day, resting in the corner of the tribute space. To the people of Port Wells, Elliot Granger had come to mean more than the uniform he once wore. He became a quiet emblem of strength, of endurance, of humility that didn't ask for applause. He kept to his same routine, fixing furnaces, teaching kids at the community garage, and walking to the bar every Friday night in the same worn jacket and scuffed boots. Elliot didn't change, but the world around him slowly, meaningfully did. Neighbors started greeting one another differently. People paused more, listened deeper. The town began to notice the ones who didn't speak up, who sat back in corners. Maybe that's the legacy Elliot never meant to leave, but did anyway. Not by shouting, not by chasing attention, simply by showing up. Always, even when no one was looking. On the 1-year anniversary of the night he was told to leave, a new plaque was mounted on the wall. He didn't ask for justice. He didn't demand it. He just reminded everyone what it looked like. The plaque bore no signature. It didn't need one. Everyone already knew whose story it told. They never once called him a hero, not in headlines, not in town meetings, and certainly not inside Miller's tap room. Because Elliot Granger never wanted to be called anything at all. He just kept coming back, quietly, steadily, without fail. Every Friday evening, just before sunset, he'd make his way through town, past the post office where the clerk would nod and say, "Evening, Mr. G," past the hardware store, where someone always reached to hold the door, past the mural on the side of the youth center, where someone had painted his boots beneath a tree. No face, just a quiet presence, and then to the bar. Same corner, same seat, same folded piece of paper in his pocket. But now he was no longer alone. Sometimes a young man grieving a brother lost in the desert would sit beside him. Sometimes a daughter who never understood why her father woke up screaming would find her way to that table. Sometimes it was a stranger who didn't know what to say, but knew they needed to be there. And Elliot always made room, never asked why, never offered advice. He simply listened or let the silence do it for him, because he understood something most never will. Some stories don't need to be told aloud to be understood. They just need someone willing to sit beside them. He was a man meant to be witnessed, not heard. Elliot Granger never sought attention, never changed much over the years. He never grew comfortable with recognition, never accepted free meals, special honors, or heartfelt tributes. And yet, in his unassuming silence, he left behind something enduring. A quiet blueprint for how to live with dignity, for how to carry strength without the need to declare it. What he left wasn't just for Port Wells. It was for every person who's ever overlooked the older man sitting quietly in the corner. For every passerby who failed to see that not all strength wears ribbons or makes speeches. Some strength wears dust on its shoulders, carries silence like a badge of honor, and stands wrapped in a dignity that never needs to raise its voice. That's the kind of man Elliot was. The bar still stands today, not just as a place to gather, but as a living reminder of him. The tribute wall inside has grown with time. Pictures, notes, medals, handwritten memories. Every Friday, the same bourbon glass is set on the counter, untouched. And across from where Elliot used to sit, there's a chair that's never really empty. Even when no one fills it, you feel the presence of those who once did. And perhaps if you sit there long enough, the ghost of those who still do. Because legends don't always come with fireworks or headlines. Sometimes they just sit, and in their silence they teach us something. In a world that spins faster each day, where noise becomes currency and attention is the loudest voice in the room, maybe, just maybe, it's time we begin to value the quiet ones again. Men like Elliot Granger never ask for a stage. They don't chase fame. They don't trend. But they carry something far heavier and far more important. Duty, sacrifice, and a kind of strength forged in action, not words. So the question lingers. How many men like Elliot have we walked past? How many stories have faded into the background because we never stopped to ask or never cared enough to notice? In today's America, where the gap between generations can feel like a canyon, where too many veterans feel invisible or forgotten, perhaps Elliot's story reminds us of something we've lost along the way. That true dignity is quiet. That real respect doesn't retire with age or fade with time. That silence, when it comes from men like Elliot, can speak louder than 1,000 shouted slogans. Maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. Maybe it was never about why Elliot didn't speak. Maybe the real question is, would we have listened if he did? So now we turn it to you. Have you ever known someone like Elliot? Someone who never boasted, never explained, but somehow changed you just by being there? Have we forgotten how to honor the quiet strength that built the world around us? Imagine if more public places, bars, schools, libraries, city halls, held a seat for the silent ones. The ones who never asked to be remembered, but deserve it anyway. If this story stirred something in you, write respect in the comments. Share it with someone who carries their dignity without asking for a spotlight. Or tell us about the Elliot in your own life, the one who shaped you quietly, steadfastly, without ever needing applause. And if stories like this matter to you, if honoring those who serve without fanfare feels important, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because sometimes a single name, a folded flag, or one empty chair can teach us more than 100 speeches ever could. Thank you for spending this time with us. Wherever you are, in a noisy city, a quiet town, or simply a booth in the corner, may you never forget, true strength doesn't need to speak, it just needs to be seen.